The two brothers played together. They worked together with their father in the fields, and they were the best of friends. They heard stories from their mother and father about a life that was, a garden full of food and the richest of blessings. But this was not their life. They had to work hard and labor to produce the food that was always plentiful in the stories of their parents' garden. Cain, the older brother, was the dutiful firstborn and was the farmer. He worked hard with the ground and became quite skilled for being the first of his kind. His younger brother Abel tended to dream a little bit more, and he could do so as he was out watching and caring for the flocks of sheep his family now possessed. In addition to the garden, their mother and father told them of a time when they would walk side by side with God, their Creator. Their sons, Cain and Abel, had never seen God that closely, but had heard all the stories. Abel especially would love to imagine what it was like to be face to face with God, as his parents had been. On rare occasions, they would hear from God, but it was nothing like what their parents had experienced. And yet, in spite of their parents' sin, and now their sins against God, God had still established a way by which Cain and Abel could come a little closer to God. It was bloody and messy, but if they would take a baby lamb without defect and sacrifice it as an offering to God and set it ablaze, the blood of that animal would temporarily atone, forgive their sins. Their sacrifice would bring pleasure to God, and they would be in good standing with Him. Cain, however, struggled with the idea that his efforts and his work with the ground was not sufficient to God. He chafed at the idea that he had to ask his brother or pay his brother for one of his flock in order to sacrifice correctly before the Lord. In fact, the Lord had told him these very words, trying to instruct Cain as to how he, the Creator God, must be worshipped. But Cain would not hear it. And his anger and resentment grew day by day. And finally, letting sin and anger fester in his heart, Cain plotted against Abel and killed his brother. Did you ever realize that the issue that angered Cain so much that he would kill his brother Abel wasn't so much envy against Abel, but it was rooted in an issue and a struggle that he had with God. It was an unwillingness in Cain's heart to obey God and how God said he was supposed to be worshipped. If we have any doubts this morning as to the importance and severity of how God is to be worshipped, we can see the importance that's born out of the lives of Cain and Abel. Good morning, my name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are, as Matt said, we are moving through into week 2 of our series, God's Big Ten, the 10 Commandments and why they still matter. And last week we were introduced to the commandments, and not just the why they still matter, but we were also given the first commandment. Do you guys remember what the first commandment is? You shall have no other gods before me, Exodus 23. They're not just commandments, but they're in many places called the 10 words. They were Hebrew words, or very short Hebrew words or phrases that stated what the commandments were to be. Now, we have to remember that when Israel was given these commandments, they were a people that had a very defined culture. They had been slaves in Egypt, or they had been in Egypt for 400 years, slaves for most of that time. Joseph, the son of Jacob in Israel, had moved his family into Egypt to escape a famine. And kings grew up, and the nation grew. And it says in there, a Pharaoh rose up who did not know Joseph, and they enslaved the people of Israel. And so you have a people who have been enslaved for hundreds of years. And what do we know about Egypt when we think of ancient Egypt? What do they like to have? A lot of gods. There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of them. There's a couple I want to show. One god we're familiar with possibly, Ra. Ra is what god? The sun god. And he takes the form of a falcon. They would like to take animals and make them, personify them with their gods. So Ra, the sun god. Another god that you've seen, if you've done anything having to relating to the pyramids or the tombs, is Anubis, the god who watches over the dead. And he has the head of a jackal or a dog. There's the crocodile god who is over the Nile and fertility, and there's all these gods for all these ways of life. And the people of Israel lived in this culture. They were immersed in it. This was their life. Apart from this unseen God that their parents told them, when they engaged the Egyptians at every level, they were constantly bombarded with this idea of other gods. The first commandment was given clearly, succinctly by God to break this trend. You shall have no other gods before me, period. Now, we just saw some examples of the Egyptian false gods, but we don't worship jackal heads and we don't worship falcon heads and crocodiles too much today. Matt touched on this a little bit last week, but I want to get your thoughts on this. What are some of the false gods that we struggle with today in 21st century America? Name them. Money, materialism. What else? Leisure, comfort, vanity, beauty, success, our job, or job in security. A job could be, I want to be hyper successful or I want to be uber secure, but a job could fit into both of those. What else? What are some other things? Entertainment, retirement, comfort, getting that 401k just to have that certain number so that I, at 65, can check out and ride out without a care to worry about. These are just some of the gods that we struggle with. And they're a lot more subtle than a dude with a jackal on his head. Well, just like God commanded the Israelites who had Egypt all over them as they arrived at Mount Sinai to have no other gods before him, he commands us, his people here in the 21st century in America, with 21st century America all over us, to likewise have no other gods before him. And then we transition to Exodus 20, verse 4. And that's where we begin here this morning with the second commandment. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. The passage will also be up on the screen. This is the longest commandment that we are introduced to of the commandments. And I'll read. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, as Matt mentioned last week, there are certain denominations that draw distinctions in a different place. The Catholic Church and some Protestant churches combine the first and second commandment together, and they draw a distinction in the final commandment, commandment number 10. What we, as a Protestant church, and understanding with what our Protestant theologians and biblicists have determined, is that there should actually be a division in the first and second commandment in the beginning, and the last commandment should more or less be combined into two. Now, whereas the first commandment forbids us to worship false gods that Matt talked about last week, the second commandment, really, if you look at it, forbids us to worship the true God falsely. It is not just an additional, okay, these are other gods, and here is how you worship other gods. This is what they're going to look like. But it's more personal than this. Because in that day, the Egyptians had made a habit of, we must make an image of this God that we are going to worship. We've lived in a culture where they had images of the gods they're going to worship. If we're going to worship our God, we must have an image of him for us to worship, right? Wouldn't you think, if that was the culture in which you were immersed, that that is how you should respond? But God, very clearly after saying, do not worship any other gods before me, comes out and says, and you shall not try to make an image of me. It is not enough that we worship God alone and no other gods, but there are important guidelines by which we are to worship God. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard this too, and you've had conversations about God and religion, but I can't tell you how many times when I've talked with people, Christians, professing Christians, where I've heard them say, well, I kind of worship God in my own personal way. And that does not work. The second commandment flies in the face of this idea that you and I can worship God in our own personal way. No, we can't. Because it is forbidden for us to make an image a personal reflection of who and what God is supposed to be. And this morning, rather than talk about this idea that money and success, which we've heard about idols in our lives, this morning I want to talk about this idea that we're supposed to not just worship God, but we're supposed to worship God the way that He, for very important reasons, has designed and intended for us to worship Him. Does that make sense? Because I think we are deceived, or at least we overlook the seriousness and the importance of some of the aspects in which maybe we've missed the mark here. Maybe some of the struggles in our lives, maybe some of our issues with God have come as a result of not understanding how this second commandment applies to our life here in 2011. Now, why is this such a big deal to God? Well, first, God is God. He's the creator. And it is His right to tell His people, His followers, those whom He created, and He sustains every moment. You realize right now that the atoms aren't flying off of my body into the remote parts of the universe because God is holding them together, right? Colossians 1 says, not just did God create it, but the very essence and power of the Spirit is holding the atoms on our bodies, keeping us alive, that we don't fly off into the remotest parts of the universe. Whether we love God or we hate Him, whether we believe Him or whether we curse Him, God is sustaining us. Sustains us every moment of our lives. And He, because of that, because He's the Creator, He gets to determine how worship of Him should look. We also see the importance of this in the story of Cain and Abel. Think about that. The first murder, the first two people born on the earth, one of them kills the other. And it's over this issue of what does God say? Does the authority of God rule in their lives? Now we're going to see that Moses did not come down from the mountain with 10 words to just change the behavior of his people. He wasn't coming down to try to, okay, you acted this way in Egypt, now act this way differently. The 10 Commandments, the law of Moses, as much as we talk about how it is this weight and this cumbersome thing that Jesus delivered us from, the intention of the law was to change people's hearts. It was to reveal to them a God that loves them and that they themselves are willing to surrender to and to follow. And we need to remember that it's about the changing of the heart. The 10 Commandments aren't etchings in stone. But later on, God says, what was written in stone, I will write. In the book of Jeremiah, I want to write my law upon their hearts.